where the secrets of the heart are written with ink and sealed with scandal. Welcome to channel, The Countess Chronicles.
Here's something nobody tells you about survival. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones everyone calls gentlemen. You know what I'm talking about, right? That person who seems perfect on the surface, charming, well-connected, respected, but your gut is screaming that something's deeply wrong. Now, what if I told you that in 1815 London, a young woman named Edith faced exactly this nightmare, and her only escape route was so audacious, so brilliantly desperate, that it would either save her life or destroy her reputation forever? We're talking about a world where a woman's word meant nothing, where powerful men operated with absolute impunity, and where one wrong move could ruin you for life. But here's where this story gets insane. Edith didn't just escape her predator. She accidentally trapped herself in a marriage with the coldest, most emotionally unavailable man in all of England, the Duke of Thornwood, a man so icy that society literally called him the Duke of Ice. A man who explicitly told her on their wedding night, "Don't expect love. I'm not capable of it." Imagine that. You escape one prison, only to walk willingly into another, trading physical danger for emotional isolation. Sounds like a terrible trade, right? But what if I told you that this impossible arrangement, this marriage built on convenience and desperation, would unravel secrets, expose conspiracies, and ultimately reveal that the coldest hearts sometimes hide the deepest capacity for love? This isn't your typical romance story where everything works out easily. This is about a woman who weaponized society's own rules against itself, about a man who'd built walls so high he'd forgotten what it felt like to be human, and about how two broken people accidentally saved each other while trying to save themselves. The forbidden truth nobody wants to admit? Sometimes the system is so rigged against you that the only way to win is to stop playing by the rules entirely. Edith figured that out in about 3 seconds when she made the most insane decision of her life. She faked a fainting spell in a crowded ballroom, gambling everything on the reaction of a man she barely knew. So if you've ever felt trapped, ever faced an impossible choice between bad and worse, ever wondered how people survived in systems designed to crush them, this story is for you. Because what happened next wasn't just about one woman escaping one predator. It was about dismantling the silence that protected monsters, about two people learning that vulnerability isn't weakness, and about discovering that sometimes the person you least expect becomes your greatest ally. Stick with me, because this tale of scandal, strategy, and unexpected love is about to teach you something profound about power, courage, and the dangerous game of survival in a world that wasn't built for people like us. You know, there's something terrifying about a predator who wears a smile, and Lord Ashford was exactly that kind of monster. He wasn't the type you'd spot lurking in shadows. No, he was the one sitting beside you at dinner, making your mother blush with compliments, charming everyone in the room. That's the real enigma of evil, isn't it? When Edith first encountered him at Lady Pemberton's ball, she felt it immediately. That cold shiver down her spine, despite his warm handshake and perfect manners. He knew every secret code of conduct, every social loophole, every way to corner a woman without anyone noticing. In a world where reputation meant everything, Ashford held the power to destroy lives with just a whisper. And he knew it. Let me tell you how Ashford operated, because honestly, predators like him haven't changed since the 1800s. He'd been watching Edith's family for months, tracking their financial troubles like a hawk circling wounded prey. When her father's investments started crumbling, Ashford appeared at their door with an offer of help. Loans, connections, business opportunities that seemed like divine intervention. But Edith noticed something her parents didn't: the way his eyes lingered too long, the way his hand found reasons to brush against hers, the silent threat behind every generous gesture. It's like those loan sharks today who solve your immediate problem while slowly tightening the noose around your neck, right? The traces of his manipulation were everywhere if you knew where to look. Whispered stories of ruined women, families mysteriously destroyed after rejecting his kindness. The conspiracy of silence around Ashford made Edith feel like she was losing her mind. She'd heard the stories, at least 3 women whose lives he'd destroyed, including Miss Catherine Hartley, who'd suddenly moved to Scotland after refusing his advances. But when Edith tried mentioning these rumors to her mother, she was dismissed immediately. Lord Ashford? That distinguished gentleman? Edith, you're being dramatic. See, in their society, a man's word was gold, but a woman's accusation was just noise, hysteria, attention-seeking. Ashford had built his entire existence on this hidden system where powerful men protected each other, and victims were silenced or erased. Edith realized she was fighting not just one man, but an entire structure designed to enable him. The real nightmare began when Ashford started showing up everywhere Edith went. At the theater? There he was, 2 boxes over, tipping his hat. At the bookshop? What a coincidence, he was just browsing the same section. At the Ashworth garden party? He cornered her near the rose bushes, speaking in that low voice that seemed polite to observers but felt suffocating to her. Your family's situation troubles me deeply, Lady Edith. I do hope you'll allow me to assist in any way possible. The unspoken threat hung in the air like smoke. You know that feeling when someone's technically doing nothing wrong, but every instinct screams danger? That was Edith's daily reality, and it was eating her alive from the inside out. The conflict intensified when Ashford made his intentions crystal clear at the Wentworth ball. He'd maneuvered her onto the terrace, away from prying eyes but close enough to society that she couldn't make a scene. "You're a sensible girl, Edith," he'd said, his smile never reaching his cold eyes. "Your family needs help. I can provide it. All you need to do is be reasonable." The way he said reasonable made her skin crawl. She'd tried to leave, but he'd blocked her path subtly, making it look like friendly conversation to anyone glancing their way. That's when Edith understood the full horror of her situation. She was trapped in a cage made of social etiquette and financial desperation, and he held all the keys. The mystery that kept Edith awake at night was this: how do you prove something everyone refuses to see? She'd started digging, asking careful questions, gathering traces of evidence. She learned that Miss Hartley wasn't in Scotland. She'd been sent to a workhouse after her reputation was destroyed. She discovered that the Blackwood family had lost everything after Mr. Blackwood confronted Ashford about his advances toward Mrs. Blackwood. But every piece of forbidden truth she uncovered just made her more aware of how powerless she was. Without witnesses willing to speak, without documents, which Ashford had surely destroyed, without allies who'd risk their own standing, she had nothing but her word against his. And his word, backed by title and wealth, would always win. Then came the breaking point. Ashford sent flowers to her home with a note that read, "Thinking of our future together." Her mother squealed with delight, a Duke's close friend showing such interest, while Edith felt her world collapsing. That night, she overheard her father discussing accepting Ashford's financial offer, which came with the understanding that Edith would seriously consider his suit. The silence that society demanded was becoming a noose around her neck. She had maybe weeks before her family's desperation would hand her over to this monster. The social structure that was supposed to protect young women was instead delivering her gift wrapped to a predator, and nobody saw anything wrong with it. So there Edith stood, at the edge of a cliff with no good options, when desperation sparked something dangerous: creativity. If she couldn't fight him directly, she'd have to outmaneuver him. She needed someone powerful enough that even Ashford would back down. Someone whose presence alone would create an invisible shield. And then, at the Worthington ball, she saw him across the room. Tall, imposing, untouchable. The Duke of Thornwood, the one man in London whose reputation was so impeccable, whose power so absolute, that even Ashford wouldn't dare cross him. A wild, impossible plan began forming in her mind. It was crazy, potentially disastrous, but it was the only card she had left to play. Sometimes when you're drowning, you don't think about the logic of grabbing a rope. You just grab it and pray it holds. So Edith had this absolutely insane idea. And honestly, when desperation meets intelligence, you get either genius or disaster. Sometimes both. She'd spent 3 sleepless nights analyzing every rule, every social code, every unspoken law that governed their world. And that's when she found it. The loophole hidden in plain sight. See, in Regency society, if a woman appeared to faint or fall ill in public, she had to be removed immediately to preserve decorum and modesty. It wasn't optional. It was mandatory. The enigma she'd cracked was this: propriety could be weaponized. If she collapsed at the right moment, in the right place, near the right person, she could escape Ashford's clutches without anyone questioning why. It's like finding that one glitch in a video game that lets you skip an impossible level. You know? The plan was risky as hell, but Edith had studied it from every angle like a chess master plotting 20 moves ahead. At the next ball, the Berkshire Grand event that everyone who mattered would attend, she'd position herself strategically. When Ashford inevitably approached her, and he would, because predators can't resist cornering their prey, she'd stage a dramatic feint. The remnants of Victorian fainting couches and smelling salts weren't just decorative. They were part of an entire protocol designed to protect women's delicate constitutions. Once she collapsed, society's rules would force someone to carry her to a private room, and Ashford couldn't follow without raising massive suspicion. It's the same energy as faking a phone call to escape a bad date, except this was life or death stakes wrapped in silk and propriety. But here's where it gets complicated, because Edith wasn't just gambling with her safety. She was gambling with her entire future. If she fainted near the wrong person, someone in Ashford's pocket, or someone who didn't care about her well-being, she'd be delivered right back into his hands in a more vulnerable position. The mystery she had to solve was this: who in that ballroom could she trust absolutely? Who had enough power that even Ashford would back down? Who would actually help her instead of just following protocol mechanically? She spent days mentally cataloging every prominent figure who'd attend, weighing their reputations, their allegiances, their character. It's like when you're in trouble and scrolling through your contacts trying to figure out who'd actually show up at 3 a.m. You know what I mean? The night of the ball arrived, and Edith felt like she was preparing for battle disguised as a social event. She wore her pale blue gown, not because it was pretty, but because it would make her look more convincingly unwell if she needed to play up her illness. She practiced her fainting technique in her room, making sure she could collapse gracefully without actually hurting herself. Sounds crazy, right? But that's what survival looks like sometimes, choreographing your own rescue because no one else will. Her maid, sweet old Mrs. Davies, kept asking if she was all right, sensing something was off. But Edith couldn't tell anyone. The secrecy wasn't just for drama. One wrong word to the wrong person, and Ashford would know. The whole plan would crumble before it even started. When Edith entered the ballroom, she immediately spotted him. Ashford, looking impeccable in his evening wear, already watching her with those predatory eyes. Her heart started racing for real. Not part of the act, just pure terror. He began moving through the crowd toward her, and she felt every muscle in her body screaming to run. But running would solve nothing. Instead, she started scanning desperately for her target, the one person who could save her. The conflict raging inside her was brutal. Part of her wanted to abandon the plan and just hide in the ladies' room all night. But she knew that was just delaying the inevitable. Ashford would corner her eventually, tonight or next week or next month. This was her shot. Then she saw him. The Duke of Thornwood, standing near the far wall like a marble statue come to life, looking thoroughly bored with the entire affair. Alexander Fitzwilliam, the man they called the Duke of Ice, because he never smiled, never danced more than obligatory dances, never showed a flicker of human emotion. He was perfect. Not because he was warm or kind, she had no idea if he was either, but because he was untouchable. His reputation was so pristine, his adherence to rules so absolute, that even being associated with him would create a shield around her. Plus, and this was key, he despised irregularities and scandal. If he witnessed Ashford behaving improperly, he'd shut it down just on principle. The revelation hit her like lightning. She didn't need someone who liked her. She needed someone who hated chaos more than anything else. Ashford was 10 feet away now, weaving through dancers with that serpent smile. Edith positioned herself carefully, calculating angles like a physicist. She needed to be close enough to the Duke that he'd be the obvious person to help, but not so close that it looked staged. 5 feet from Ashford. Her vision actually started to blur from anxiety. Ironic, considering she was about to fake exactly that. 3 feet. She could smell his cologne now, that sickly, sweet scent that made her stomach turn. She made eye contact with the Duke. Just 1 second, just long enough to register his location. His ice-blue eyes met hers with polite disinterest. Ashford reached out his hand toward her elbow, about to touch her, about to trap her in another friendly conversation. As he lifted her, she let her head loll convincingly, eyes closed, playing the part perfectly. But here's the thing nobody expected. In that fraction of a second when he adjusted his grip, she opened her eyes just slightly, just enough to make sure she was safe, just enough to see where he was taking her. And he saw. Those ice-blue eyes locked onto hers, and she watched realization dawn across his face. He knew it was an act. The question was, what would he do about it? Let me tell you about Alexander Fitzwilliam, because this man was a walking enigma, wrapped in expensive tailoring and emotional ice. At 32 years old, he was everything society expected a duke to be. Wealthy beyond imagination, impeccably mannered, devastatingly handsome in that classical way that made debutantes swoon from across ballrooms. But here's the thing nobody could crack. He was completely, utterly unreachable. While other eligible bachelors flirted and courted and played the marriage game, Alexander treated social events like military operations. Execute the minimum required interactions, maintain perfect decorum, retreat at the earliest acceptable moment. The mystery that fascinated and frustrated London's elite was simple. What made the Duke of Thornwood so cold? What secret lay beneath that flawless facade? They called him the Duke of Ice behind his back, and honestly, the nickname fit perfectly. Alexander never danced more than twice at any ball, once with the host's daughter out of obligation, once with whoever duty demanded. He never laughed at jokes, never engaged in gossip, never showed even a flicker of genuine emotion. It's like he'd calculated the exact minimum amount of humanity required to function in society and refused to give 1 ounce more. I've met people like this, haven't you? The ones who've built walls so high that you start wondering what they're protecting or what they're hiding from. Every gesture was controlled, every word measured, every interaction performed with the emotional investment of someone reading a grocery list. The traces of warmth that most humans naturally display? Completely absent. It was unsettling, fascinating, and infinitely intriguing all at once. But here's what nobody knew. The hidden truth buried so deep that Alexander himself tried to forget it. 7 years ago, he'd been completely different. He'd been in love, stupidly, recklessly, entirely in love with a woman named Victoria Ashworth. They were engaged, the wedding planned down to the last detail, and Alexander had opened his heart in a way he'd never done before. He'd written her poetry, terrible poetry, but sincere, planned their future, imagined growing old together. For 6 months, he'd been vulnerable, exposed, human. And then, exactly 1 week before the wedding, Victoria left him a note and disappeared. She'd run off with a merchant's son. No title, no fortune, no prospects. Because, as she wrote, "He makes me feel alive in ways you never could, Alexander. You're too perfect, too controlled. I need passion, not perfection." The devastation that followed wasn't just heartbreak. It was complete ego death, a shattering of everything Alexander thought he knew about himself and the world. For weeks, he barely ate, barely slept, barely functioned. The scandal rocked society, with everyone whispering about the jilted Duke, pitying him, gossiping about what he'd done wrong. And somewhere in that darkness, something in Alexander broke and reformed into something harder, colder, infinitely more controlled. He made a decision that would define the next 7 years of his life. Never again. Never again would he be vulnerable. Never again would he let emotion override logic. Never again would he give anyone the power to destroy him. It's like when someone gets burned so badly that they decide fire itself is the enemy, you know? He didn't just guard his heart. He encased it in permafrost. The transformation was methodical and absolute. Alexander threw himself into managing his estates with mathematical precision, increasing productivity by 40% through sheer analytical genius. He read philosophy. Stoicism became his religion. Marcus Aurelius, his patron saint. "You have power over your mind, not outside events," became his mantra. He eliminated anything in his life that couldn't be controlled or predicted. Emotions, spontaneity, connection. His staff learned quickly that he valued efficiency over warmth, precision over personality. The conflict between what he'd once been and what he'd become was something he refused to acknowledge, burying it under layers of routine and rigid self-discipline. To the outside world, he was the perfect Duke. Inside, he was a man terrified of feeling anything at all. What made Alexander's situation even more tragic was that he genuinely believed he was better this way, that he'd evolved past the weakness of emotion. He'd convinced himself that love was a trap, that passion was dangerous, that the only safe way to exist was through absolute control. When his mother gently suggested he should remarry, he'd shut down the conversation with cold logic. Marriage is a social necessity that can be fulfilled without emotional entanglement. When the time comes, I'll select a suitable candidate based on practical considerations. Imagine living like that, reducing human connection to a business transaction, treating your own heart like it's a liability rather than an asset. It's the kind of psychological armor that protects you from pain, but also from life itself. The night of the Berkshire Ball, Alexander attended purely out of obligation. The hosts were important political allies, and appearances mattered. He'd calculated he needed to stay exactly 90 minutes to fulfill social requirements. Then he could return home to his library and the new translation of Epictetus that had just arrived. He was counting down the minutes, mentally reviewing estate reports, existing in that detached state he'd perfected. The silence of his inner world was almost meditative. No messy emotions, no unpredictable feelings, just calm, cold logic. He noticed the usual parade of marriage-minded mothers parading daughters past him, the usual sycophants trying to curry favor, the usual tedious social theater. None of it touched him. He was a statue among humans, watching but not participating, present but not really there. Then something shifted. He noticed a young woman across the room, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because of the fear in her eyes. Lady Edith, he recalled. He knew everyone's names and titles as a matter of duty, though he rarely bothered with deeper acquaintance. She was being approached by Lord Ashford, and the body language was all wrong. Alexander had spent 7 years studying human behavior with clinical detachment, learning to read micro-expressions and subtle cues precisely because he refused to rely on messy intuition. What he saw made his analytical mind flag a warning. Predator and prey. The way Ashford moved, the way Edith's shoulders tensed, the trapped look in her eyes. It was textbook intimidation disguised as social nicety. And then she looked directly at him, just for a second, and he saw something that cracked through his careful detachment. Pure desperation. What happened next would later baffle Alexander when he replayed it in his mind, analyzing his own actions with the same clinical precision he applied to everything else. When Edith collapsed, his body moved before his brain authorized it, pure instinct overriding 7 years of careful control. He caught her with reflexes he didn't know he still possessed. And in that moment of contact, something bizarre happened. She opened her eyes, just a fraction, just enough, and he saw the truth immediately. It was fake. Masterfully executed, but fake. His logical mind processed multiple scenarios in seconds. She was escaping something or someone. She needed help, and she'd chosen him as her unlikely savior. The revelation should have annoyed him. He hated deception, hated irregularities, hated being pulled into other people's drama. But instead, looking at that mixture of fear and desperate hope in her eyes, feeling her trembling in his arms, something long buried stirred. And before his logical mind could veto the decision, he made a choice that would unravel everything he'd built. He decided to help her. The moment Edith's body went limp in Alexander's arms, time seemed to fracture into 1,000 tiny decisions happening simultaneously. His mind, that perfectly calibrated machine of logic, was cataloging everything. Her weight distribution suggested conscious muscle control. Her breathing pattern was too steady for genuine unconsciousness. And that split-second eye contact had revealed the entire conspiracy. But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of exposing her deception, instead of following his rigid adherence to truth and propriety, Alexander made a choice that surprised even himself. He looked down at this woman who'd weaponized society's rules with breathtaking audacity and thought, "Clever girl." The enigma of his own reaction would haunt him later. But in that moment, instinct overrode analysis. Alexander's voice cut through the gasps and murmurs like a blade, sharp, commanding, absolutely brooking no argument. "Lady Edith is indisposed. Clear a path immediately." It wasn't a request. It was a ducal decree delivered with enough authority that people scattered like startled birds. He adjusted his grip, lifting her fully into his arms in a way that looked both protective and proper, and started moving toward the private drawing rooms. But here's the genius part. As he walked, he leaned down slightly, his mouth near her ear, and whispered in a voice so low only she could hear, "Breathe naturally, or they'll notice the deception. And for God's sake, let your right arm hang limp. You're holding it too stiffly." The fact that he was actively coaching her performance while maintaining his ice-cold exterior to everyone else? That's the kind of contradiction that reveals character, you know? The crowd parted like the Red Sea, everyone whispering and speculating. Was it the heat? Was it her corset? Was it some mysterious lady's ailment? Ashford stood frozen mid-reach, his predatory advance completely thwarted by the one thing he couldn't fight: public propriety and the Duke of Thornwood's unassailable reputation. The look on his face was priceless, a mixture of frustration and calculation, trying to figure out how to recover his prey without revealing his true nature. Alexander noticed it peripherally, filing it away in that massive mental database of his. He'd seen men like Ashford before, had studied the traces of their manipulation tactics with academic interest. But feeling Edith trembling against him, real fear beneath the fake feint, transformed abstract knowledge into visceral understanding. This wasn't a social chess game. This was someone's life, hanging in the balance. As Alexander carried Edith through the corridor toward the ladies' drawing room, something strange was happening inside his carefully controlled psyche. He could feel the warmth of her body through the layers of fabric, could sense her rapid heartbeat betraying her fear, despite the outward stillness. It had been 7 years since he'd held anyone, 7 years since he'd allowed physical proximity beyond the mandatory social touches. The silence he'd built around himself, that careful, cold distance, was suddenly feeling less like protection and more like isolation. He pushed the thought away immediately. This was merely him fulfilling a basic human obligation, nothing more. Certainly nothing that required examination or feeling. Yet his arms seemed reluctant to simply hand her off to the first available chaperone, and that reluctance was unsettling. They reached a small private parlor, and Alexander kicked the door closed behind them with more force than strictly necessary, partly for dramatic effect, partly from an emotion he refused to name. He set Edith down on the settee with surprising gentleness, then stepped back immediately, creating distance, rebuilding walls. His voice, when he spoke, was pure ice. "You have 60 seconds to explain what just happened before I call your mother and expose this entire charade." But even as he delivered the threat, he was positioning himself between her and the door, unconsciously protective despite his harsh words. It's like when you're angry at someone, but you're still making sure they're safe, you know? The conflict between what he said and what he did was fascinating, revealing cracks in that perfect control. Edith sat up slowly, abandoning the pretense now that they were alone. Her eyes met his, no longer frightened prey, but a cornered animal showing surprising steel. "Lord Ashford," she said simply, and Alexander saw her hands shaking as she gripped the settee cushion. "He's been pursuing me, relentlessly. My family is in financial trouble, and he's using that as leverage. He's done it before, ruined other women, destroyed families who refused him. But no one will believe me because he's respectable, connected, powerful." The words tumbled out in a rush, like a dam breaking. I couldn't fight him directly. I couldn't report him. I couldn't even avoid him without causing scandal. So She gestured helplessly at the situation. I know it was desperate and ridiculous, but I didn't know what else to do. Alexander stood perfectly still, processing this information with that analytical mind of his. Every word she spoke confirmed what he'd observed. Ashford's predatory body language, her genuine terror, the systematic nature of it all. He'd heard whispers about Ashford over the years, dismissed them as gossip, but now those fragments were reassembling into a damning pattern. The mystery wasn't whether she was telling the truth. His instincts, rusty but apparently still functional, screamed that she was. The mystery was why he cared. Why was he standing here listening instead of walking away from this mess? Why did the thought of her being cornered by that snake make something hot and sharp twist in his chest? Something that felt dangerously like anger on someone else's behalf? He'd spent 7 years not caring about anyone's problems but his own, and that had worked perfectly fine. Until now. 3 women, Alexander said quietly, more to himself than to her. Miss Catherine Hartley, Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, and Miss Sarah Pemberton. I remember now. They all withdrew from society around the same time they'd had associations with Ashford. He'd catalogued those facts automatically over the years, filed them away as mere social data. But now they formed a constellation of evidence, a hidden truth that had been there all along if anyone had cared enough to look. The revelation that he'd been peripherally aware of a predator's pattern and done nothing about it. That felt uncomfortably like complicity. His jaw tightened. Why didn't anyone stop him? But even as he asked, he knew the answer. Because men like Ashford existed in every generation, protected by power and silence and the very social structures that claim to uphold morality, and men like him, like Alexander, had stood by doing nothing because it wasn't their problem. Until suddenly, looking at this brave, desperate woman who'd risked everything on a wild gamble, it became his problem. The question was, what the hell was he going to do about it? Alexander turned away from Edith and walked to the window, staring out at the torchlit gardens below as if the manicured hedges held answers to questions he didn't want to ask. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable exactly, but weighted with possibility and danger. She'd laid her cards on the table, exposed her desperation completely, and now she was waiting for his verdict. Would he help? Would he walk away? Would he expose her deception to society? Edith watched his rigid back, the way his hands clasped behind him in that military posture he always adopted, and felt her heart hammering against her ribs. This man was an enigma, cold as winter frost, but he'd helped her escape Ashford. The question burning through her mind was simple. Who was the real Alexander Fitzwilliam beneath that icy exterior? 2 full minutes passed. Edith counted them by the ticking of the mantel clock before Alexander spoke. When he did, he didn't turn around, just continued staring into the darkness beyond the glass. "There's a solution," he said, in that measured, emotionless tone. A radical one, but effective. He paused, and Edith could practically hear the calculations running through his brilliant mind. Then he turned, and those ice-blue eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Marry me." The words hung in the air like a detonation, and Edith actually felt dizzy. Not fake faint dizzy, but genuine shock coursing through her system. Of all the things she'd expected him to say, that hadn't even made the list. It was so absurd, so impossible, so completely out of nowhere, that for a moment She wondered if she'd misheard. What? Edith managed, eloquence completely abandoning her. Alexander's expression didn't change, as if he'd just proposed a business merger rather than marriage. Think logically, he continued, pacing now with controlled energy. If you become the Duchess of Thornwood, Ashford cannot touch you. My title, my wealth, my reputation, they'd become your shield. Your family's financial difficulties would be resolved immediately. You'd have complete protection from any man who'd dare compromise you. He said it like he was listing the benefits of a property investment, utterly clinical. But then something flickered across his face. Doubt? Concern? It vanished so quickly Edith almost missed it. However, and here his voice took on an even colder edge, you need to understand what this would entail. Or rather, what it wouldn't entail. Alexander stopped pacing and faced her directly, his posture rigid, his expression carved from marble. This would be a marriage of convenience, pure practicality. You'd have my name, my protection, my resources. But do not expect love, Lady Edith. Do not expect romance or affection, or any of the sentimental notions young women are taught to desire. Each word was a brick in the wall he was building between them, even as he proposed binding their lives together. I am not capable of those things anymore. Whatever part of me that could feel such emotions died 7 years ago, and I have no interest in resurrecting it. The forbidden truth he was revealing, that he'd once been different, once been capable of love, hung unspoken, but palpable in the air. You'd live in comfort and safety, but our marriage would be a title only. Separate lives under the same roof. Do you understand? Edith's mind was racing, trying to process this impossible proposition. On one hand, escape from Ashford, financial security for her family, the protection of being a duchess, freedom from the marriage market's predatory waters. On the other hand, a lifetime bound to a man who was essentially offering her a gilded cage, promising nothing but cold civility and emotional distance. It's like being offered a castle made of ice. Magnificent shelter, but you'd freeze to death inside it. You know? She studied his face, looking for any crack in that perfect control, any sign that beneath the frost was a man who might someday thaw. But Alexander's expression remained impassive, giving nothing away. He'd made his offer and now stood waiting for her decision with the patience of someone who genuinely didn't care which way she chose. "Why?" Edith finally asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Why would you do this? You don't know me. You clearly don't want a wife in any meaningful sense. So why offer this at all?" It was the mystery that didn't add up. If he was truly as cold and detached as he claimed, the logical choice would be to simply have Ashford dealt with through social or legal channels, not to chain himself to a stranger in matrimony. Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, and something raw leaked through despite his controlled delivery. "Because I watched 3 women suffer and did nothing. Because men like Ashford operate in the shadows, while men like me stand by in our perfect propriety, claiming it's not our concern." He paused, and when he continued, his voice was quieter. "Because you were brave enough to save yourself when no one else would. That deserves acknowledgement, not abandonment." The weight of his words settled over Edith like a heavy cloak. This wasn't romance, it was guilt, obligation, perhaps a twisted sense of honor. But it was also real protection, genuine safety in a world that offered women precious little of either. She thought about her options with brutal honesty. Option A meant continuing to dodge Ashford. watching her family sink deeper into debt, eventually being forced into exactly the kind of arrangement he wanted through sheer desperation. Option B meant accepting this cold bargain, becoming a duchess in name only, living beside a man who'd explicitly promised never to love her. It's the kind of choice that shouldn't exist, right? The kind that makes you realize how broken the system is when your best option is still a form of prison, just a prettier one with better locks. "I need time to think," Edith said, though she could already feel which way she was leaning. Alexander nodded once, sharp and precise. "You have until tomorrow evening. I'll call on your family under the pretense of ensuring you've recovered from tonight's incident. If you've decided to accept, wear the blue ribbon in your hair, the one you wore tonight. If you decline, wear any other color, and I'll simply pay my respects and leave. Either way, I'll ensure Ashford understands that you're under my protection as a family friend, which should buy you some breathing room." He was already planning contingencies, ever the strategist. But then he did something unexpected. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his blue eyes, and his voice dropped to something almost gentle. "Edith. May I call you Edith?" She nodded mutely. "Whatever you decide, know this. You deserve better than what society has offered you. If you accept my proposal, I cannot give you love, but I can promise you respect, safety, and freedom within the bounds of propriety. Sometimes that's enough." Edith watched him leave, his departure as controlled and precise as everything else about him. She sat alone in the parlor, her mind whirling with impossible decisions and dangerous possibilities. The traces of her normal life, the hope for a love match, the dream of mutual affection, the simple desire to be wanted rather than needed, were crumbling before the harsh reality of survival. Could she really bind herself to a man who'd explicitly warned her he'd never love her? Could she build a life in the permanent winter of his emotional distance? But then again, what choice did she really have? As the clock struck midnight, she thought about that blue ribbon still pinned in her hair, and wondered if tomorrow she'd have the courage to wear it again. The revelation that was settling into her bones was this: sometimes the best option isn't good. It's just better than the alternative. And in a world rigged against women like her, maybe that had to be enough. Edith wore the blue ribbon. Of course she did. Survival instinct overrode romantic idealism every single time when the alternative was Lord Ashford's continued pursuit. The wedding happened within 3 weeks, scandalously fast by society's standards, but perfectly legal and proper. It was a small ceremony, elegant but cold, attended by only the necessary witnesses and immediate family. Alexander stood beside her at the altar, looking like a beautiful statue, reciting his vows with the emotional investment of someone reading a shipping manifest. When the vicar said, "You may kiss the bride," Alexander gave her the briefest, most chaste peck on the cheek, a gesture so devoid of warmth it might as well have been a handshake. And just like that, Edith became the Duchess of Thornwood, bound to an enigma wrapped in expensive tailoring and emotional permafrost. The first morning in Thornwood Manor, Edith woke up alone in a bedroom that could have housed her entire previous home. Alexander had disappeared to his study before dawn. Apparently, he slept only 4 hours a night and spent the rest managing his extensive properties. A maid informed her that His Grace took breakfast at precisely 7, expected her to join him, and preferred silence during morning meals. It was like receiving an instruction manual for living with a particularly complicated piece of machinery. When Edith entered the breakfast room, Alexander stood politely, pulled out her chair, and then buried himself in correspondence without a single word beyond "Good morning." The silence was so thick you could have cut it with a butter knife. It's like being married to a very attractive, very wealthy ghost who occasionally remembered you existed for the sake of propriety, you know? But here's where things started getting weird. In small, almost invisible ways that Edith only noticed because she was paying attention. On her third morning, she mentioned casually to a maid that she missed reading the Morning Chronicle with her breakfast, something her father used to get. The next day, it appeared beside her plate without comment or acknowledgement from Alexander. A week later, she sighed while looking at the formal gardens and said to no one in particular that she wished there were more roses. Her mother had loved roses. Within 3 days, an entire rose garden was being planted outside the library windows. When she asked Alexander about it, he barely glanced up from his papers. The gardener suggested it. Seemed reasonable. But Edith wasn't stupid. She was beginning to recognize the traces of care hidden beneath layers of denial. The real breakthrough came during her mother's illness. Edith received word that her mother had taken a bad fever, and she'd immediately panicked. Good medical care was expensive, and even though Alexander had settled her family's debts, she felt uncomfortable asking for more. She'd been pacing in the drawing room, trying to figure out how to broach the subject, when Alexander walked in to retrieve a book. He took one look at her face and said, in that flat tone, "What's wrong?" When she explained haltingly, expecting judgment or irritation, he simply nodded once. "I'll send Dr. Whitmore, the royal physician, immediately. He's the best in England." Before she could even thank him or discuss payment, he was already writing instructions. The mystery that confused and touched her was this. If he didn't care, why did he notice she was upset in the first place? If this was truly just a business arrangement, why did her distress seem to matter to him? 3 months in, Edith had accidentally revolutionized the management of Alexander's estates, and she didn't even realize she was doing it. She'd been bored out of her mind. Being a duchess involved a shocking amount of sitting around looking decorative, so she'd started reviewing the household accounts just to have something to do. That's when she noticed inefficiencies everywhere. Overlapping duties, wasted resources, outdated systems that no one had questioned in decades. So she did what came naturally. She redesigned everything. Better crop rotation schedules, streamlined staff responsibilities, new supply contracts that cut costs by 30% while improving quality. She left her suggestions on Alexander's desk, expecting nothing. But the next morning at breakfast, he actually looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since the wedding. "Did you create these projections?" She nodded nervously. He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering behind those ice-blue eyes. "They're brilliant. Implement them." That was it. But his eyes lingered on her a fraction longer than necessary before returning to his correspondence. The staff started warming to Edith in ways they never had with Alexander, not because she was trying to win them over, but because she genuinely saw them as people rather than functions. She learned their names, asked about their families, noticed when someone was unwell. Revolutionary concept, right? Treating servants like humans. Mrs. Holloway, the head housekeeper who'd served the Fitzwilliam family for 30 years, actually teared up when Edith arranged for her daughter to receive medical treatment for a chronic condition. "His Grace never noticed," she'd said quietly. "Not because he's cruel, Your Grace, but because, well, he doesn't notice anything that isn't in a ledger or a book." But Edith was beginning to suspect that wasn't entirely true. Alexander noticed more than he let on. He just processed human needs through that analytical brain of his, responding to problems rather than emotions. The forbidden thing neither of them acknowledged was how their nighttime routines were slowly converging. Alexander spent every evening in the library, reading philosophy and estate reports until midnight. Edith, restless and unable to sleep in her enormous empty bedroom, had started reading there too. At first, deliberately choosing times when he wouldn't be there, but gradually their schedules overlapped. At first, they'd sit in complete silence. Her on one end of the massive room, him on the other. But one night, she'd laughed at something in her book, a genuinely delighted sound, and he'd looked up sharply. "What are you reading?" His tone suggested he couldn't fathom what would produce that reaction. "Candide," she'd answered. "Voltaire's satire on optimism." Something had shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe respect. "You read French philosophy?" "I read everything," she'd said simply. And for the first time, they'd actually talked. Really talked. About ideas, about the hypocrisy of society, about how the world claimed to operate versus how it actually functioned. That conversation became a pattern. Night after night, they'd end up debating Rousseau versus Hobbes, discussing whether humanity was inherently good or corrupted by society, arguing about justice and morality and the nature of power. Alexander's mind was incredible, sharp, vast, capable of holding dozens of complex arguments simultaneously. And Edith could match him, which clearly surprised and intrigued him. Sometimes she'd catch him watching her with this puzzled expression, like she was a mystery he was trying to solve using insufficient data. The enigma for both of them was this: they'd agreed to a marriage without intimacy or connection, yet somehow they were building exactly that through philosophy and midnight debates. The walls Alexander had built so carefully were developing cracks, tiny fissures where something resembling friendship, or maybe more, was seeping through. Neither of them was ready to name it, but it was there, growing in the silence between their words, in the way their eyes met and held a fraction too long before looking away. Something was changing, and they were both too stubborn or too scared to acknowledge what it meant. Just when Edith was beginning to think maybe, just maybe, she could build something resembling happiness in this strange marriage, Lord Ashford came back like a vengeful ghost. It started with whispers at a garden party, subtle, poisonous insinuations that spread through London society like a plague. "Did you hear about the Duchess of Thornwood? Apparently the marriage was quite rushed. One wonders why." The conspiracy of gossip was carefully orchestrated, and Ashford's fingerprints were all over it. He couldn't have Edith now that she was protected by Alexander's title, but he could damn well try to destroy her reputation and, by extension, damage the Duke's pristine standing. It's like when someone can't win, so they flip the entire game board, you know? If Ashford couldn't possess her, he'd ruin her. The rumors escalated quickly, each one more vicious than the last. Ashford started implying publicly that he and Edith had been intimately acquainted before her marriage, that she'd compromised herself and trapped the Duke into a hasty wedding to save her reputation. The hidden truth he was weaving was a masterpiece of manipulation, just vague enough to avoid direct slander charges, just specific enough to destroy her credibility. At balls and dinner parties, conversations would stop when Edith entered rooms. Former friends suddenly had pressing engagements elsewhere. The traces of her social acceptance were crumbling, and worse, people were beginning to question Alexander's judgment. The Ice Duke finally shows emotion, and look what happens. He gets manipulated by a scheming girl. The secondary damage to his reputation was clearly Ashford's revenge for being thwarted. Edith felt herself drowning in shame and fury, the conflict between wanting to fight back and knowing that defending herself would only make things worse. Women who protested their innocence too loudly were assumed guilty, another brilliant catch-22 of their society. She'd been sitting in the drawing room, staring blankly at needlework she had no interest in completing, when Alexander returned home early from Parliament. One look at her face, and he stopped mid-stride. What happened? His voice was sharp, that analytical mind already cataloging the evidence of her distress. When she explained the latest rumor, that Ashford had told Lord Pemberton they'd had an understanding before her wedding, Alexander's expression went absolutely glacial. Not cold like his usual detachment, but cold like the moment before something snaps and shatters. The words tumbled out of Edith then, all the fear and guilt she'd been bottling up for weeks. "I'm going to leave, Alexander. I'll request an annulment. I can't let your reputation be destroyed because of me. You gave me protection, and I've repaid you by bringing scandal to your door. It's not fair to you. You didn't sign up for this mess." She was crying now, which she hated, but couldn't stop. "You can say I deceived you about my past. Society will believe it. You'll be the victim, and your standing will recover. But if I stay, they'll keep tearing you apart." It was the most words she'd spoken to him in one breath since their wedding, and each one felt like cutting off a piece of herself. Because somewhere in the last 3 months, this cold, impossible man had become important to her in ways she'd never intended. Alexander crossed the room in 3 strides and gripped her shoulders. Not gently, but not painfully either. Just firm, grounding, forcing her to look at him. "Stop," he commanded, and something in his voice made her breath catch. His ice-blue eyes were blazing with an intensity she'd never seen before, and his carefully controlled facade was cracking wide open. "You think I care what those hypocritical parasites think? You think I care about my perfect reputation that's built on absolutely nothing but birth and luck?" His voice was rising, actual emotion bleeding through for the first time since she'd known him. "Edith, for the last 3 months, you've made me feel something I thought was dead. You've challenged me, matched me, forced me to see beyond my own carefully constructed prison. And I—" He stopped, jaw working, like the words were physically painful to produce. "I'm a fool," Alexander continued, quieter now, but somehow more intense. "A complete fool who was so afraid of being hurt again that I almost missed what was right in front of me. You're brilliant, brave, kind in ways I'd forgotten existed. And somewhere between your estate management revolution and our debates about Kant, I fell in love with you." The revelation hung in the air like a detonation, and Edith's mind went completely blank. What? "I'm in love with you," he repeated, as if saying it again would make it real to both of them. "And I've wasted 3 months keeping you at arm's length because I was terrified of admitting it. So no, you're not leaving. And no, I don't give a damn what Ashford or anyone else says, because tomorrow I'm going to the House of Lords, and I'm going to destroy him." The transformation in Alexander was stunning. It's like watching a dam break, years of suppressed emotions suddenly flooding through the cracks. "I've been gathering evidence since the night of your fainting spell," he said, releasing her shoulders and pacing like a caged predator. "Testimonies from the women he's ruined, financial records showing blackmail payments, correspondence proving his systematic targeting of vulnerable families. I have enough evidence to not only exile him from society, but potentially bring criminal charges." He turned back to her, and the forbidden anger in his eyes was almost frightening. "I should have done this months ago, but I convinced myself it was enough to just protect you. That was cowardice. Men like Ashford operate because men like me, with power and resources, choose not to act. That ends tomorrow." Edith was reeling from multiple revelations at once. He'd been investigating Ashford this whole time. He was planning to weaponize his political power, and, most shocking, he loved her. "Alexander," she started, but he wasn't done. "I'm going to make this right," he said, and there was something almost desperate in his voice now. "I'm going to clear your name publicly. I'm going to ensure Ashford can never hurt anyone again. And then I'm going to spend however long it takes proving to you that I can be the husband you deserve, not just the cold arrangement I offered." He moved closer again, and this time his hand came up to cup her face with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the fury directed at Ashford. "I know I have no right to ask this after keeping you at a distance for 3 months, but is there any chance you could eventually love someone as damaged and difficult as me?" The mystery that had been building between them suddenly made perfect sense. All those small gestures, the way he'd notice what she needed before she asked, how their conversations had become the highlight of both their days. Edith realized with stunning clarity that she'd been falling for him too, slowly and against all logic, drawn to the man beneath the ice rather than repelled by his walls. "Alexander, you absolute idiot," she said, laughing and crying simultaneously. "I've been in love with you for at least a month. I just thought you'd never feel the same, so I kept it hidden." The relief that washed over his face was beautiful, transforming him from marble statue to living, breathing man. He kissed her then, properly kissed her, and it was nothing like that perfunctory peck at their wedding. It was desperate and tender, and 7 years of suppressed emotion finally finding release. The next day, Alexander Fitzwilliam, Duke of Thornwood, walked into the House of Lords and systematically dismantled Lord Ashford's entire existence. He presented evidence with the cold precision of a surgeon and the righteous fury of an avenging angel. 3 other women, emboldened by the Duke's public support, came forward with their own testimonies. The scandal was enormous, the kind that actually had consequences because it was backed by undeniable proof and unassailable credibility. Ashford was stripped of his position, exiled from society, and fled to the continent to avoid criminal prosecution. It was the kind of social destruction that people whispered about for decades, but more importantly, it sent a message. The silence that protected predators could be broken, and sometimes justice actually prevailed. Edith watched from the gallery as her husband, her real husband, not just in name, fought for her and for every woman Ashford had hurt. And when Alexander returned home that evening, exhausted but triumphant, she was waiting. Their marriage was about to get a second beginning, one built not on convenience and fear, but on genuine love, hard-won trust, and the revelation that sometimes the coldest exteriors hide the warmest hearts. So here we are at the end of Edith and Alexander's story. But really, this is just the beginning of something much bigger, and that something is you. Because let's be real for a second. How many times have you felt trapped like Edith? How many times have you faced a situation where all your options seemed terrible, where the system felt rigged against you, where speaking up seemed more dangerous than staying silent? This isn't just some fictional tale from 1815. This is a mirror reflecting struggles that still exist today. The names change, the clothing changes, but the fundamental conflict between power and vulnerability? That's timeless, my friend. Here's what I need you to understand. Edith didn't wait for someone to save her. She saved herself first, then found an ally. Alexander didn't magically become a better person. He chose to break down his own walls and do the hard work of feeling again. Neither of them had perfect solutions, but they had courage, creativity, and the willingness to risk everything for something better. So let me ask you something uncomfortable. What walls have you built around yourself? What Lord Ashfords in your life Are you tolerating because speaking up seems too dangerous? What version of happiness are you settling for because you've convinced yourself it's the best you can get? These aren't rhetorical questions. I genuinely want you to sit with them. The revelation that should shake you to your core is this: the system that trapped Edith still exists in different forms today. Predators still hide behind respectability. Victims still get blamed instead of believed. Good people still stand by, doing nothing because it's not their problem. But here's the empowering part. You have more power than Edith ever did. You have a voice that can reach thousands. You have legal protections she never dreamed of. You have the ability to build communities of support that cross continents. So what are you going to do with that power? Are you going to stay silent, like Alexander did for 7 years? Or are you going to speak up, act up, and dismantle the conspiracies of silence that protect the wrong people? I want you to take one concrete action this week. Just one. Maybe it's setting a boundary with someone who's been crossing your lines. Maybe it's reaching out to someone you know is struggling. Maybe it's finally admitting to yourself that the situation you're in isn't working and you deserve better. Maybe it's being vulnerable with someone instead of hiding behind walls like Alexander did. Whatever it is, do it. Because Edith's story teaches us that waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect solution, the perfect ally, that's just another form of paralysis. Sometimes you have to fake the faint before you know who'll catch you. You know what I mean? And here's the uncomfortable truth that'll either motivate you or make you angry. Every day you don't act is a day the Ashfords of the world win. Every day you stay silent about injustice is a day you're complicit in maintaining it. Every day you hide behind your walls is a day you're choosing safety over truly living. I know that sounds harsh, but sometimes we need harsh truths to break through our comfortable denial. Edith had weeks to make her decision. You have right now. So what's it gonna be? Are you going to close this video, feel inspired for 5 minutes, then go back to the same patterns? Or are you going to let this story actually change something in how you operate in the world? Think about the people in your life who are trapped, who are suffering in silence, who are being gaslit into doubting their own instincts. You could be their Duke of Thornwood, the unexpected ally who changes everything just by choosing to see them, believe them, and act on their behalf. But you could also be the bystander Alexander was for 7 years, knowing something's wrong, but convincing yourself it's not your responsibility. Which one will you be? That choice defines your character more than any title, wealth, or reputation ever could. The mystery of who you really are gets revealed not in comfort, but in crisis. Not in what you say, but in what you do when it costs you something. So here's my challenge to you, and I'm dead serious about this. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below with one action you're going to take this week to break your own patterns or help someone else break theirs. Hold yourself accountable. Because stories only matter if they change behavior, right? Otherwise, we're just consuming entertainment, while the world stays exactly the same. And I don't know about you, but I'm tired of the same old silence, the same old power dynamics, the same old acceptance of unacceptable situations. Edith and Alexander broke their patterns in an era that gave them way fewer tools than we have. So, what's our excuse? If this story resonated with you, if it made you think differently about courage, vulnerability, or the power of unlikely alliances, then subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Because we're going deep into more stories like this, more forbidden truths that history tried to bury, more revelations about power, survival, and the human capacity for change. This isn't just entertainment. This is a masterclass in recognizing manipulation, building genuine connections, and refusing to accept the limitations that society tries to impose on us. The next story might be even more intense, might challenge you even more deeply. But that's the point, isn't it? Growth happens outside comfort zones. Remember, Edith started with nothing but desperation and creativity. Alexander started with emotional walls that seemed impenetrable. But they both ended up transformed, victorious, and genuinely happy. Not because circumstances magically improved, but because they chose courage over comfort, vulnerability over safety, and action over paralysis. That same choice is sitting in front of you right now. So what's it gonna be? Are you ready to stop being a bystander in your own life? Are you ready to call out the Ashfords and break down your own walls? The answer to that question will determine everything that comes next. Choose wisely, my friend. Your future self is watching.